Let me bring
Yeah.
up the text. I know y'all know the text,
Yeah.
but the audience may not. So let's
You've got
maybe
it.
just
Great.
demonstrate this to them and show them the difficulty for everyone involved, Catholics and
Yeah.
Orthodox, and we're going to tackle the question of whether he was a heretic. So here's Agatho writing to the emperor. It's read out loud at the council. The council accepts the letter. They think it's the bee's knees. They love it. They think it's divinely inspired. When they wrote back to Agatho. And so they affirm what's being stated in here. They don't say any of this is heretical. Now, what Agatho is trying to do is he's trying to say, look, because the Roman See is indefectible in its teaching office, because it never errs from the path of apostolic tradition, I get to tell you this Christological doctrine. I get to tell you what my view is, and I get to tell you that monothelitism is wrong. And they accept that. But watch what he does here. He talks about how the Apostolic Church of Christ, in the context that is the Church of Rome, you'll see that here in just a second, has never erred from the path of the apostolic tradition. Now, the difficulty, however, would be is if we're just going to say this is only ex cathedra teachings. Well, look, he's saying the See has never erred from the path of apostolic tradition and never yielded to heretical innovations. If you're going to say that, well, maybe he was teaching in his ordinary magisterium heresy, but not ex cathedra, I think that's too simplistic. I don't think that either one of y'all are saying that, but I think some people might argue that. I think that's too simplistic because he's arguing for something broader with indefectibility. He's saying the See itself doesn't yield to heretical innovations. And I think that some people would read that as including the ordinary magisterium. Now, others might not, but I think they would have to read that distinction into the text and severely limit this promise to just like ex cathedra teachings only, which may be a possibility, but I think you really have to read it in there, and there might be some challenges. But he's saying, look, this is based on a divine promise. He explicitly says it's a divine promise from Jesus, not from a council, but from Jesus. He says it's from the promise, Peter, behold, Satan has desired to have you that he might sift you as wheat, but I pray for you that your faith fail not. And then he applies that to the papacy, and he says, this promise is to Peter's faith and his successors. And then he goes on to note that all of the popes, even my predecessors, which would include Honorius, have always confidently done this very thing. Done what? Never yielded to heretical innovations. And notice the big thing here. He's saying that the See, the apostolic See, remains undefiled unto the end. And so it's not that it's just had a good track record up until this council. It will be undefiled unto the end, not just because it's really good at guessing doctrine, but rather because of a divine promise. And so the difficulty is he's saying the Roman See never defected from the faith, never, yielded to heretical innovations. And he's even saying my predecessors have been in keeping with this, but who's one of his predecessors? Honorius.
Yep.
Now, the same council that accepts this a few sessions later, for various reasons, condemns Honorius as a heretic and anathematizes him. So there's a difficulty involved for everyone. For the Catholic, it is how, number one, how does one accept the notion that the apostolic See is undefiled unto the end, with the notion that Honorius was condemned as a heretic? Also, for the Catholic, how does one explain that even Honorius here is claimed to be in keeping with the promise of being undefiled unto the end, and yet he's also condemned in the same council a few sessions later? That's the challenge on the Catholic side. For the Orthodox, it's obvious. The claim that a pope could be a heretic, that's in line with what they say. However, the notion that the apostolic See will be undefiled unto the end because of a divine promise, and that that Honorius was in keeping with that, that's a problem for them. Because number one, is their council contradicting itself on a judgment about Honorius? And number two, how in the world can you accept the doctrinal and ecclesial assertion that Rome's apostolic teaching authority is undefiled unto the end? That's a doctrinal statement that I think is fundamentally incompatible with Eastern Orthodoxy, because this is the seeds of papal infallibility. Once you've conceded this right here, this papal dogma, you've left Eastern Orthodoxy and you've effectively become an Eastern Catholic. So I think this is actually a greater difficulty for Eastern Orthodox, because I do think from the Catholic perspective, you can basically say that whenever Agatho is saying that even his predecessors were undefiled unto the end. He's talking about the teaching authority of the papal office. However, later on, when Honorius is condemned, he's being condemned for manifesting heresy in some lesser degree that doesn't rise to the level of teaching authority. There's some difficulty, however, even with that thesis, as I've pointed out, because you do have, as Eric has pointed out, from the Acts of Constantinople 4, you do have the Acts saying that Honorius taught heresy. So now you have to read that as, okay, is he teaching that in his magisterium, or is this just some kind of figure of speech of he taught this in some kind of non-official capacity? Either way, everyone involved is going to have to read some premises into the data, because the data itself, I think, can be read in multiple ways. However, I think the data itself lends itself more to Catholicism than it does Eastern
Yeah,
Orthodoxy.
yeah. It puts you into the medieval debates of the West. It you away from Eastern Orthodoxy, and it puts you. At worst, you could be a conciliarist. You know, you could try to be a conciliarist, a Gallicanist, a Febroniist, a Josephine. You could try going that route. Of course, that is riddled with problems. I think I've seen somebody on Twitter who is he follows Jacques Bossuet, yeah, French Gallican, that he believed in papal infallibility, but he believed that it was only in concilia with the episcopate. But that still gets you away from Eastern Orthodoxy. So yeah, that's what you've identified here are tensions that, in fact, pointing out the tensions is a pro-Catholic argument, because it shows that where you have a tension, you have Catholicism, but where you have an utter contradiction, you have Eastern Orthodoxy. So where do you want to be? Do you want to be in the room where you have a tension, or do you want to be in the room where you have an about face contradiction?
Hey, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, the like button, and if you want to support the channel, visit patreon.com/Reason and Theology.